always remind me that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Olga, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, for me, it's also morning, so it's 3 a.m. right now in the east coast of Australia. And but yeah, well, as Olga said, I have always tried to help people taking this course to understand a little bit more about how the projects are, or the project management principles are used in data management and business intelligence and all these kind of projects. And it has actually helped a lot of people. We know that for a fact. So we continue doing this. So thank you very much, Olga. I'm not using my computer today, so something is happening to the camera, and I'm more interested in giving you the content than trying to troubleshoot what's happening with it. So you already saw my picture. That's me. So anyway, so let's start. So the conversation will have probably around 40 to 45 minutes of content, and then I will just leave a few minutes open for questions. Some other people will be seeing this presentation recorded. So for those of you who are watching the recording, you can reach me through social media or other means, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Now, you see my presentation okay, Olga?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's start. So basically what we are going to try to do for the next 40, 45 minutes is to talk about the project management concepts. And as Olga said, this is important because every project right now has a way to be developed through some kind of standards that will allow the project to have a better chance of being successful. And many people get into doing things that they don't even know they're projects, and they are called to do more things every time, and they don't really know how to approach this. And that's the reason why project management has been an integral part of this course from day one. So we always start by just talking about what is a project. And the reason why we do this is because the word project means different things to many different people. And it is important to level set the definitions and the components that you have to have in a project. And this is important also because down the road, you will see that many of the elements that we're going to discuss today are linked to the definition of a project itself. So there's 2 or 3 things that you always have on a project. The first thing that you always have is that it is temporary, meaning that it has a beginning and it has an end. So there's no such a thing as a running project, something that is happening all the time, and therefore this is the eternal project. No, that doesn't exist. For a project to exist as a project, you have to have a beginning and you have to have an end. Somebody at some point says, we're going to start a project, and somebody at some point says the project is done. So you always have what we call a time-bounded effort. And again, as I said before, many of the elements that we're going to discuss later actually support the concept of this temporary activity. Now, the second part that is important is the fact that it always creates a unique end result. This is a little bit controversial for some people, right? Because I'm going to use another example that probably you will understand regardless of your expertise and so on. Is like a house, right? So when you build a house, you say, oh yeah, I have a project to build a house. And then you finish the house and it's done. And then you're going to build another house. You say like, well, but that is the same house I had before. No, there's going to be a different house. Even if the design is the same, even if what you have inside the house is the same, the house itself is built in a different physical location. It is built in a different time frame. So from the project perspective, it is a different project because it is a different house. So every time that you start a project, you have a unique end result. Even if it seems like you're doing the same things that you have done before, it always is different at the end, right? So you have those 2 elements. The 3 elements that also that always you have in a project is the fact that you have certain components that are always there. And the 4 components that I'm showing here in this slide are the ones that you typically find in a project. So you find people. Somebody has to execute the project. Somebody has to do the work, right? So if it's a small project, probably will be a small group of people, and sometimes it's even one person. It doesn't really matter. You have people. Sometimes you have larger groups. That's fine. The second time that you always have is time. So you have a timeline. And again, you go back to the definition of the characteristic of a project, you have to have a timeline in which you actually execute the project, right? So you have a certain time, and we will talk about that later, what it means in the context of a project. The third thing is that you have a budget. So you spend some resources, you spend some money. You have to have some things in place in order to be able to complete the project, right? This is a very interesting discussion also when people say like, oh yeah, but we do internal projects in our office, so we don't have actually any budget for that. Like, well, do you know what? Even if you're not paying anyone to do that, you're actually spending money to complete your project, even if it's internal, because your salary costs money, your offices cost money, your the IT that you use for your project costs money. So you are actually spending money to do that. The fact that you don't account for it doesn't mean that you don't do it, right? So you always have some expenditures or some costs associated to your project. And the last thing that you always have is interrelated tasks. So one of the things, and we'll see that later, that you have in projects is that in order to properly plan and execute a project, you have to uh, divide it in pieces. Those pieces, we call them tasks. And one very interesting thing about projects is the fact that you do not execute those pieces in isolation. You always have those pieces linked to each other some way, right? So that's what we call the tasks are interrelated. So when you have those three things, something that has a beginning and an end, something that creates a unique result, and something that includes people, time, budget, and tasks, you have a project. And again, as Olga said before, it doesn't really matter if it's small, if it's large, if it's 1 week, if it's 3 years, it is a project. And most of the concepts that we're going to talk about today apply to those, what we call endeavors, those pieces of work, because they are projects. They always go back a little bit and say like, okay, well, if that's a project, it seems like everything's a project. No, not everything is a project, right? Things that are not projects are, for example, things that are simple enough that can be accomplished without a plan, right? So you just go and do things. You don't have to plan for it, just do things. That's not a project. If it's something that is regular, repetitive, routine, that's not a project, right? One example that I always use people because people know it is when you go and you work in a store and you close the store for the day and you go and pick up the money from the cash register and you count the money and you put the money in an envelope and you took it to the bank. Is that a project? That's not a project because it's something that happens every day and always happens the same way, right? So that is another example of something that is not a project. And something that you do that doesn't have a result is not a project either. Because if it doesn't produce anything, why would you call that a project, right? So those are kind of hints that something that you're doing is not a project. Of course, we're going to focus here on things that are projects. So therefore, we're going to focus on the characteristics that I just mentioned before, right? If you want to just remember everything in one little sentence, what you have here in the bottom of the screen is what I always use. A project is temporary and it produces something. If you remember those two things, you are probably most likely than not dealing with a project. Now, the way that those things that I just mentioned come together in a project is through what we call the triple constraint. So there are three dimensions that are always in play in a project. Those three constraints are time, scope, and costs. Why do we call it a constraint? Because any one of those that moves changes the other two, right? So I think that even though this concept is a little bit advanced, you kind of understand why, right? So if you have a budget to do something in X amount of time, and that project starts to get delayed and delayed and delayed, it's almost like a logical conclusion that you're going to spend more money, for example, right? Or if you decide that this is what I'm going to do for my project, this is my scope, this is the work that I'm doing, and then somebody says like, oh, but why don't you add this? Oh, why don't you add this? As soon as you say, I'm going to add things, again, it's almost like logical to think like, well, that's going to take me more time. And by the way, it's going to cost more. So every time that you take these three in the context of work, and more specifically in the context of a project, you're talking about things that are going to be linked to each other. And that's the reason why we talk about them as a triad of constraints, because each one of them is going to become a constraint in a project. Now, one thing that is true is that in some projects, some of those constraints are more important than others. And probably the one that you're most aware of is the budget, right? The money, the cost. Because it's very typical that you're asked, like, okay, well, here you have this $100,000, go and execute this project. So you are already bounded, you're already constrained by the fact that you cannot spend more than $100,000. But here is what is interesting, right? If they tell you this is $100,000 and you have to do that, one of the first things that you have to do when you start a project is to go back to what they are telling you have to do, the scope, and say, okay, yes, yep, I can actually execute this project and complete this work with this $100,000. Or, no, there's no way that I'm going to complete all this work with this $100,000. So the analysis that we do within the context of the practice of project management is to take these three constraints and look at them combined and see how they behave, against each other. Olga, are you seeing my presentation now? Just so your chat. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not checking the chat, so I hadn't looked at your comment. Okay.
No, it was just that in our website, this presentation is uploaded, so the students can go back and forth.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay, so those three constraints are key for understanding what you have to do when you manage a project, or when you're called to manage even a component of the project, right? Now, if you look at this triangle, there's something interesting here, and that is the fact that there's something in the middle that doesn't have a name. And the problem is that there is a name for that. And it is typically called the fourth dimension or the fourth constraint of a project, and it is called quality. And I'm going to explain why. Because when you are bounded by scope, budget, and schedule, by the amount of work, the amount of money, and the amount of time that you have, you're always trying to get the best that you can deliver within those three constraints, within some level of quality that you are asked for. The minimum level of quality that you can offer, or that you offer when you execute a project, is that you deliver something that works. But that's not always the case, right? So sometimes you have to deliver more because some people need more things. And even in some cases, some people may say like, okay, well, I'm willing to actually receive less quality, which is, again, doesn't mean that doesn't do what it has to do, but it means that you probably can get away from some of the conditions that you were asked to have, just because you don't have enough money, enough time, or enough resources to do your work, right? So once that you have those three variables, scope, budget, schedule, work, time, resources, you have to analyze what it means in the context of what you are going to deliver. What is the quality that you are going to offer? And that is the fourth dimension. Because at some point you may want to go back and say, you know what? No, I can't deliver everything that you want here just because I don't have enough time. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough resources, right? So the three dimensions actually become four once that you add the quality. And there's a lot of things to talk about quality, but again, we only have like 45 minutes. Just think about it as the concept of, is it what I'm delivering fit for purpose? Is what I'm delivering enough to comply with the requirements of those who have requested the project? If the answer is yes, or if it is good enough, then the answer is yep, I am working within the quality parameters. The one example that I always use is a car, right? So I'm pretty sure that you can go from point A to point B in a small Chevrolet car or in a Ferrari. Of course, yeah, of course, you can just drive from point A to point B. But we all know that it's not the same to drive a Chevrolet car than drive a Ferrari, right? The difference are many, and they're important for the people that actually want the Ferrari, right? So it doesn't really matter if you want to go from point A to point B if the person is actually expecting the Ferrari. So you have to be careful and you have to be conscious that you're also dealing with that factor of quality that in some circumstances can even be subjective, right? So we hope to have everything objective in projects, but sometimes, especially in the quality area, you may find some things that are a little bit more subjective. Okay, so now we have two things here: the definition of a project and the three elements that comply, and the three or four elements that comprise the actually doing of the project. The third concept that is common to every project on Earth, regardless of the practice, regardless of the size, regardless of the complexity, is what we call the project life cycle. And the project life cycle means what are the things that I need to do group in like different phases of different components. And if I do a project with this approach, I can actually deal with the project in a very standard way. And the project life cycle has these 5 phases. The first one is the initiation. And again, if you go back to the definition of a project, you understand why. Because at some point somebody says like, oh, I need something, right? I want a project. That is the moment where the project initiates. So it is very important for people working within the projects to understand how the project, who the project was initiated for or by. So that is what the initiation phase is just getting that first push to say, yeah, we're going to actually do a project. It could be something informal, it could be more formal. We hope to have things that are a little more formal, but sometimes it's informal. Then comes probably what I will consider my preferred step in the project life cycle, and is planning. So one of the things that separates projects from any other thing that you do in life is that you have to sit down and plan. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later, because that is becoming I'm going to say controversial, but a concept that some people like, oh yeah, but I don't need to plan so much. Or even some people say, I don't need to plan. Well, you are actually planning, even if you're not necessarily, if you don't know that you're planning. But planning means that you have to sit down, think about what you want to do, and define a way in which you are going to plan. So to execute your project, right? In other words, you have to think about it before you actually start doing things. So that's planning, and we'll see in a second what it means. Then the third step, or the third component of this project life cycle, is executing. Well, this is way easier if you actually have planned. So executing, our most classical definition is, executing is just to perform the activities that you have planned for. It's as simple as that, right? Now, that's another reason why you have to plan, because you cannot go into executing mode if you don't have anything to do based on what expectations or requirements or what, I mean, what is that you're doing? So once that you start executing, you enter another critical component of the project lifecycle, and is controlling the project. Meaning, okay, I said I'm gonna do this. You're actually doing this. What are the results that I'm obtaining? Is this what I was expecting? Is this different? Is this more? Is this less? This is where the concept of the 3 and 4 constraints actually come into play very strongly, because that's when you start to look at what you're doing and say, like, okay, where am I in budget? Where am I in time? Where am I in work? Where am I in quality? So you're actually going back to what you were asked to do. Look at your plan, look at what you're executing, and ask yourself if that is actually enough to be successful. This is a little bit misleading, so I'm just going to show you the next graphic in a second, because this is not linear in nature. And again, you will see in a second why, right? Just for now, think that what you're executing has to be controlled. And then, because this is temporary, at some point, you close the project. And I'm not going to explain too much about this, but closing the project can mean one of 3 things. One is that you complete the project, you're done. Second is you completed the project, but it's not 100% what was expected. But anyways, you ran out of money, you ran out of time. There's no more you can do about it. So you may not have delivered everything that was expected, but there's an agreement that this is as far as you can go. So you can close the project there. Or the third option is you close the project without any final deliverable, meaning this is what typically people say, that, oh, the project failed. because you're not delivering anything. Well, it may be the case, but in some cases, it may not be the case, because you may have delivered some things, right? But in a way, what you're doing is just saying like, well, this is it, right? So I'm not going to do anything else. We couldn't deliver this data management model, this business intelligence application, but yeah, we did some work, right? That's it. Project is done, close. And that is important because what it means is that people working in the project can actually move on to other things, right? I don't know if any of you have had the experience of having been involved in these never-ending projects where people don't even know what's going on, but they're always in the project. And yeah, we're almost there, right? And again, I'm not going to explain this in detail, but this is the eternal, the project's at 90% and it continues to be 90% like for the next 3 years. And it's always 90% like, okay, so what's going on here? You can't run a project like that. At some point, you need to close it. So what I was referring to is that this is not actually a linear cycle. It's more like this. So here is your initiation. Then from the initiation, you plan. And then from the planning, you start to execute or to implement. So the controlling piece or the controlling phase that I showed you is actually two things. First, you monitor, meaning you're actually looking at what is the performance of your project, what is going on with your project. Am I spending the money that I said I'm going to spend? I am using the time the way that I said I was using. Do I have the proper resources? Am I lacking resources? You monitor what's there. And based on those observations, you actually take action. Or in other words, you adapt. You make changes to the project in order to correct the way in which the project has been executed. So that's what we call the closed loop of planning, implementing, monitoring, and adapting. Because once that you decide that you have to make changes, guess what? You have to go back and plan again. And then that plan becomes an execution plan and so on and so forth, right? When do you get out of this cycle? Well, there's nothing else to do. That's when you close the project. So at the end of the day, you're always going in between planning, in executing, and controlling, monitoring and controlling, always, all the time. And that is the key aspect that we project managers do in projects. Regardless of the domain, regardless of the size, regardless of the complexity, we're always looking at what we need to plan, what are we executing, and how is it going. If you conceptually know how to deal with those three things, you're going to have no problem whatsoever working within a project. And even more, I would say, if you're actually good at doing that, you're actually a pretty good candidate to be a project manager, right? Because that is what separates us from the rest of the world, is that we can actually look at these three components within those three constraints and make things work, deliver projects. That's what people are waiting from us, right? Now, you may not be a project manager, but you may be assigned tasks within a project in which you can actually, you have to do these three things, right? And this is important. I'm just going to talk about that a little bit at the end on the kind of experience that you need in order to get a certification in project management. Because even if you are not responsible for the whole project, if you're responsible for one part of it, you have actually the experience of going through this cycle. Okay, that is important. So one of the biggest discussions right now in the field of project management is, okay, well, but there is this thing called agile. So we don't plan, we don't document, we don't do anything, we just go and do things, right? Well, so happens that it's not true. Agile just means that you do what I just showed you many times in shorter cycles. But you actually do initiation, you do planning, you do execution, and you do the control, right? In traditional projects, and especially in IT, we used to call these software development life cycles or waterfall or other approaches. In general, we call them predictive approaches because in theory, that's not true, but that's how we call it. We can predict the behavior of the project throughout the whole life cycle. I know that's not true after doing this 30 years, but that's how we portray the whole thing, right? So the late 1990s, early 2000s, a group of people came back and said, you know what, that doesn't work. What we need to do is have shorter cycles in which we do work and we deliver something, right? That is what we call adaptive or incremental approaches. So instead of planning the whole thing, I'm just going to plan little pieces and deliver that. Little pieces deliver the next little pieces. What is the idea? The idea is that I deliver part E and then part B and then part C. At the end, A plus B plus C is going to have the whole context of the project that otherwise you may have had to plan completely from day one, right? The discussion is very philosophical because, again, those people that are called agilists say, like, no, but we don't do the project lifecycle. Well, guess what? If you have a 3-week sprint, you initiate the sprint. Yes, of course, because at some point you say, yep, oops, sorry. Can you see my presentation, Olga, again?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. No, sorry, I just received a message here in my screen and I was like, what's going on here? So, okay, give me 1 sec. Just gonna get that out of the way. Okay, perfect. So you come and you plan for the next 3 weeks. Well, guess what? That initiates 3-week cycle for the project. Then you plan for it. Well, yeah, because they call that sprint planning, but it's a planning. Then they execute that. Well, perfect. That's called that sprint, but it's an executing. And then they close, deliver a little piece of the project, and it works. Great. But guess what? That is also a life cycle. And by the way, it looks exactly as the other project management life cycle. So, short announcement here. Agile project management life cycles are not different from the traditional project management life cycles. It's just that they are done in shorter cycles, but the concepts are exactly the same. Okay, so once that we get out of the way, we can continue talking about the other elements that we have here. So planning. So let's talk a little bit about planning. And again, this is planning in the context of the traditional predictive approaches or planning in the context of the agile or iterative or incremental approaches. So what you do in planning is that you find how the 3 components of the triangle relate to each other. What it means is that, okay, if I have to perform this amount of work, I need these resources, which are going to cost me this amount of money, and it's going to take this amount of time. Here you go. That's all you need in order to plan one piece of the work, right? What is important here is to understand that if one of those changes, the other actually changes, right? So if you add more work, as I said before, it's very likely that you're going to have to spend more money. Sure. Or you have to spend more time. Sure. That's not wrong. That's exactly what you need to do when you are planning, right? Some people are they panic when they see that, oh yeah, no, we have more work. And well, no, the fact that you have more work is not bad on itself. It's just that you need to be aware of that, right? You need to be aware of the fact that you have to plan for more work. Because when one changes, the other changes too, right? The tool that we use for this is called the work breakdown structure. And the work breakdown structure is just a way to split the work in little pieces. So I'm just going to show you quickly what it means, right? So you have the first level, which is typically the project. And the project is going to be split in a second level, which is, for example, objectives or functionalities of the piece that you're creating or whatever, right? And then you slice that into 2 more, that in this case, we're calling that activities, right? So you say, okay, well, I'm going to do the data extraction piece. Okay, but what do I need to do to the data extraction? Oh, yeah, you need to create a model. You need to configure a tool. You need to run certain processes. Those are the activities. And even in some cases, you have to add one more level, which is the tasks. Okay, so how do you create a model? Oh, yeah, I need to do this. I need to do this. I need to do that. So each one of these levels is a decomposition of the bigger project. And the tool is very, very useful just because when you're done decomposing, you should have 100% of the work that you're going to perform in the project. As simple as that. The way that we express this typically in project management practice is to say that anything that is not in the WBS is not part of the project. or the project is comprised of everything that is in the WBS, right? So if you're doing a data management project and somebody tells you, oh yeah, what is the manual of the application that we're running here? Like, well, is that in the WBS? No, okay. That means it's not my responsibility. I love WBSs because that really saves your your reputation when people say like, oh yeah, you actually said you're going to do that. Like, well, if you find in WBS, sure, I can say that I made a mistake. But if it's not there, I never actually said that I was going to do it, right? So it's a very important tool for us in the project management world to be able to properly plan, execute, and control the project because we know that everything that we do is part of the work with data structure. So the very first thing that you do in a project is to actually create a WBS. Now, in the agile world, it's called different, right? They call it the product backlog, but it's just a list of the things that you need to do at the end of X amount of time to complete the project, right? The only difference is that they do not create this hierarchical structure, but they create more like a list of things. But at the end of the day, they become hierarchical because, of course, there's something at the end, at the bottom of the list that you cannot complete. You have not completed all the things that are on top of the list. So, again, philosophical discussion. It is a way of doing a work without a structure. So it's a very, very important tool. Once that you have the WBS, and only then you can actually look at the resources and define what you need in order to complete the project. Because now that you have seen, just gonna go back here a second. Now that you have seen the different activities and the different tasks, you can say, oh, okay, for that I need these people. I need a developer, I need a data management expert, I need a data scientist, which is a name that is becoming very popular in this domain. I need a person who's able to set up a database. Okay, then you know what the tools are. Okay, yeah, okay, I'm gonna need Excel, I'm gonna need Power BI, I'm gonna need what tools do you need, right? Equipment, well, and this is important, third parties. So one of the things that I always tell people when we're looking at the basics of project management is that you always have to assume that you cannot do everything. Meaning you have to go back and look for someone or something that is going to perform things that you need to do in your project in order to be successful, right? So it's very rare to have a project where the person or the group that is doing the project is actually self-sufficient. So at that point, you have to look at your WBS, look at activities and say like, I can't do this. Well, I need to hire someone to do this. Or I need to buy this tool to do this, right? So you will have third parties involved, but guess what? There's no way that you're going to be able to do that, understand what you need, if you have not done your WBS. If you look at the whole project, it's almost impossible to just look at the project. Oh yeah, I'm going to need these tools. No, there's no way to do that, right? So that's one more reason why you want to break down the project, because now you can properly say, okay, I need people, I need tools, equipment, and parties. What else do you win with this? Well, then the next thing that you win is an understanding of the time that you need in order to execute. And this is one of the most complex concepts. So I have this example here. I'm not going to go through the whole example, but I'm going to explain to you what it is, right? And I don't know, at some point, maybe Olga can actually do it as a fun activity within the two groups. But we have two different concepts of time in projects. One is duration, and the other one is amount of work. Duration means how much time in a calendar it takes to do it, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 days, 1 month, whatever. It's amount of time in the calendar. But that doesn't equate and that doesn't mean that that is what we call the amount of work.
I think we lost you. The mic is not working. Ivan, are you here?
So once that you decide that you need to build a square room, you say, okay, what do I need to do? Sorry, my internet is telling me that it's unstable. So I'm just going to stop a second, let it stabilize. Continue. Okay. So, okay, I need 3 people working 3 days to finish 1 wall. Okay, that's more information than I had before, right? So how long does it take to build a room if each one of the walls is built one after the other? Going to answer this question very easily. Well, if it's 3 days, each one of the 4 walls, then it's 3, 1, 3 the next, 3 the next, and 3 the next. So that means it takes 12 days. Correct. Okay, sure, simple. How much work does it take to actually do this? 12 days. Sorry, that's not amount of work. That's duration, 12 days. Because the amount of work is actually linked to the number of resources that you're using to do that. And if you see here in the first bullet, you're saying that you need 3 people. So assuming, for example, that you have people working 8 hours a day, what you have is that the amount of work needed to finish 1 wall for that square room is actually what? 9 days of work, right? 3 people working 3 days for each wall, it means 9 days of work. And guess what? 9 days of work is not, it doesn't equal 1 day, right? So this exercise, and again, Olga, I'll encourage you at some point, if you have a fun activity to do with your students, to probably go through this. We don't have the time today. This actually shows you that in projects, you have to look at both dimensions. You have to look at the dimension duration, because it's important. Of course, people are going to ask you, okay, when is it going to be ready? You can't answer, oh, when we finish 48 hours of work. I'm going to look at you and say, like, what do you mean? Like, okay, tell me, tomorrow, in a week, in a month. So you always have to have a duration in mind. But at the same time, when you look at things, for example, cost, duration doesn't really tell you anything, because you can't pay people by duration. Well, you can, but shouldn't be, right? You pay people for the amount of work that they perform, right? So when you talk about time, in reality, we're talking about 2 different concepts. One is the duration, that is important, and the other one is the amount of work, which again is also important for everyone, right? So there's like 3, 4 more questions that you can run out of this concept of time and amount of work in order to understand what the differences are, right? And again, it's a very, very simple exercise that will actually give you a lot of understanding. But at least the concept, I think that now you understand that it's not the same to say this is going to take 3 days versus it takes actually 27 or 48 or whatever number of hours to complete 1 wall. This, oh, by the way, just going to make one more comment here. This is very closely linked, and I think I said that already, to cost. Because typically in projects, you pay for the amount of work that is performed. Typically, not always, but typically, right? So it means that if at some point, for some reason, you have to add one resource to speed up the project, the execution of the project, because you're late or because you want it later, well, when you add one more resource, you're adding more work performed, therefore paying more. That's the reason why there is a relationship between those 2 constraints, cost and time, right? You can't know, it's impossible to know the cost of a project if you haven't actually checked the time, i.e. the amount of work that you need to perform in order to complete your project. It's completely impossible. You can't do that. Which brings us to one of the biggest problems in project management is when they tell you from day one, this is all you have to do and you have $100,000. I'm going to tell you something right away. That doesn't work. It doesn't work because, well, unless it has been a project manager and has done all the analysis, there's no way that you can just look at the project, the amount of the deliverables that you need to do, and just magically say it's like $100,000. There's something that we call budget constraint projects, which means this is the amount of money that I have and I can't give you more. Sure, we can work with that. But typically what happens in those projects is that something has to give. Either you use less resources or you deliver less things, but you are bounded by the amount of money that you are allocated to, right? And that's my life. Like, I mean, I'm given projects all the time and I'm told execute this project with this amount of money and off you go. Well, the first thing that I do is this analysis to make sure that I'm actually able to deliver what they're asking me with them on a money they're giving. And the other thing that is important here is that once that you have the WBS and once that you understand the work that you need to do, you can, at that point, you can start sequencing activities. You can decide what is first, what is required to do the next activity, how much work does it take, and so on and so forth, right? So, like in the previous one, I can add some very interesting changes to the idea of building a square room. If I say, for example, well, I can start one wall as soon as the previous one has started, but 1 day later. So I have to build one, wait 1 day, and start the next. Okay, that is going to affect duration immediately, right? Remember we said 12 days? Okay, let's put that condition there. If you have to wait 1 day, it's 3 days plus 1, that's 4, plus 3 is 7, wait 1 is 8, the next one, 3 is 11, wait 1 is 12, build the next one is 15. So just adding that condition that I need to wait 1 day to start building the next wall, the duration of that project moved from 12 days to 15. Oh, so it is actually important. How do I sequence activities? Of course, that's important. And that is also a key component of planning the project. Why do I have to wait 1 day? Well, I'm not an expert on construction, but I know that sometimes you have to wait for the wall to be completely settled and all that, the materials to be dry and all that. So you have to wait. So sometimes it's not even that you don't want to build the next wall right after you finish the first one, it's because you can't, right? So there are conditions, there are restrictions that you have in projects that will allow you to do that. In data management, for example, I know of many, many constraints that you have to deal with, which actually take you to this, right? So you say, oh, I'm going to extract all this data to actually analyze it. Okay, so you have an activity in your program that in your project that says like extract information. And then somebody says like, oh, but right after I'm going to do this. Oh yeah, it's going to take 2 days. Well, I have been in projects. I remember one that I did once starting my career here in Canada, in which we did what we call an ETL, which is extract the data to start the analysis of the data. The ETL took us 5 months. Extracting the data from that huge database we have took us 5 months. Could I have planned for having the ETL day in 1 day and then start doing the rest of the work? Of course, I would have been able to plan that. Was that plan logical? No, because of course, you have a 100 million record database. It's not going to take 1 day to extract information, right? It's going to take probably a month, 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, like in this case. So you have to deal with those constraints, right? So that sequencing is based on those conditions that you may have in your particular project. So those are the key elements of planning your project. You have to break down the work, and once that you break down the work, you can analyze the different components that you need in order to execute or to properly plan the execution of that project. Is that all? No, there's many other things that you need in order to be able to properly plan. I'm highlighting 4 here. We actually plan 9 different areas in projects. We call it the knowledge areas. But in this case, I'm highlighting 4 more stakeholders. So who is giving you the information to know what you want from the project, right? So it's something we call stakeholder management, and now it's more like affected parties management, which means who's giving you the conditions, who's giving you the restrictions, who's giving you the money, who knows about the product that you're building, who knows about the conditions that they need. Well, that people need to be involved, and you have to plan for them to be involved, right? Communications, who is going to get what information when, what way, for what purpose, right? The most common communication tool in projects, probably all of you have heard about it, is status reports. So people need to know where the project is. Of course, they need to know, right? So if somebody has to make a decision, they need to understand they're making the right decision. Well, the only people that know how the project is going is you as part of the project team. So you give them the information, but that has to be planned, right? I'm gonna jump to the last one to leave Riz at the end. So procurement. Remember I told you Remember, I told you that you have to probably acquire things. You have to buy tools. You have to bring a contractor. Well, that has to be procured. That has to be planned. For those of you who have had the joy of working in the Canadian environment, procurement in Canada is very complex because there's a lot of rules. So, for example, in government, our procurement cycles are typically 2, 3, 4, 5 months. So you cannot just go and say, "Oh, I need this for tomorrow." Doesn't happen. So guess what? You need to plan for that. You need to plan for procurement. So that's something else that is going to be part of this. And the last one is risk. So risk is probably the most important of the non-core plan areas that you have to be aware of. Risk in the context of projects means uncertainty. And if there's one thing that is very, very common in projects is uncertainty, right? Because you don't know everything. That's exactly the reason why the agile approaches were created. Because the predictive approach, the traditional approach, assumed that you knew everything at the beginning of the project, therefore you can plan the whole project, therefore you can deliver the whole project. And I can tell you that is not true, ever. So the agile approach, meaning breaking down the project into more cycles, gives you a little more certainty because then you can look at what you're going to execute in the next 3 weeks. You're certain of this is what I'm going to do, and you can plan for it, right? But regardless of the approach, you're always going to deal with uncertainty, and uncertainty means risks. And planning for risk is probably one of the most important things in project, right? In other courses with Olga, we spent hours and hours talking about risk management. I do teach a risk management course in Vancouver Island University, and it's 16 weeks, so you can imagine. Just to say, for the purposes of this short presentation, that you have to be aware of those things that are uncertain in your project, because those are the things that probably are going to create change in your project, which, by the way, is not wrong. Some people, especially when they're younger or they're not very expert on projects, they feel like, oh, I need to change something. They feel bad because, oh, I should have known. Like, no, there's no way, right? There's no way that you know everything that is going to affect the project. Therefore, don't worry, you deal with that. And that's exactly the reason why you enter in the cycle of planning. Okay. Okay. And the last thing that I have here. Okay, no, there's one more thing, but this is an easy one. I told you. How do you execute your project? Well, you perform the activities that you plan. End of story. That's it, right? Some people say like, oh yeah, it's so difficult to execute projects. Like, no, executing projects is the easiest thing because if you have a good plan, you just go and execute the project. As a project manager for many years, I joke that my job is very easy because once that I have good plan, I just sit down and relax because my assumption is that my team is going to execute the project. That's not totally true, but the reality is that if you have a good plan, you execute the plan and it should be okay, right? And you only have to deal with the next thing that we're going to mention, right? So executing really is not a problem as long as you have a good plan. The other piece that is key is the monitoring and controlling. And I use this term interchangeably, but there's actually two different things, right? So monitoring, as I said before, is compare what you have. And the plan that we currently have in a project, we call it by baseline plan. So this is what I have planned so far. It may change later, but this is what I have. So you take the baseline and say, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. What is my performance in terms of the different constraints? Am I spending more money, less money? Am I behind? Am I ahead? Do I need more resources? What do I need to do, right? And you evaluate the results. That's monitoring. What we say is that monitoring is passive. And then based on that performance analysis, you control. You say, okay, well, I need to do this in order to bring the project back into play, right? So you take the actions to correct. You take those actions, you evaluate the consequences of the change, and you see what happens, right? This is the area where agile approaches are very, very good because you do this all the time. Not even within the three cycle, not even every three weeks or in the cycle that they decide to do, but even within the cycle, you take these actions, right? But again, this is a concept that has been around for many, many, many years. you should be able to monitor and control the project regardless of the approach that you have. And this is the other thing that is important from the project management perspective, right? Because if you can't do monitoring and controlling, you basically doom in the project. Because this is what projects change all the time. This is what makes the management successful or not, right? So these are the different pieces. Monitoring is passive, controlling is active, okay? And this is what I had, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, for today. So I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes to talk about a little bit about the certification, because it's a question that always comes. And I know that there will maybe some questions, but again, because this group is watching this live and some others will watch the recording, it's actually better for me to just take about this, right? So one of the things that is important in project management is that once that you have all these concepts and understand how they work in the real life, in the context of a project, regardless of what kind of area, you can show to the market that you're actually an experienced person in project management, right? So there are different levels of certification. There are some that are very generical, like one of them is the Certificate Associated in Project Management, which means that you know the basics, you understand the language, you can describe these things that I just described. You should be able to do it just by understanding the concepts. You don't have to have experience. So it's basically a certification that is based on knowledge. It's fairly easy to attain. You just sit down, study, present the exam, and you get the certification, right? CAPM is called Certificate Associated in Project Management. Once that you have the experience, you jump into what is called a project management professional. So typically you have to study, of course, but you have to show roughly 5 years of experience in projects. Now, this is what something I told you before becomes important. Doesn't mean that you have to be the project manager. As long as you have experience doing these things, initiating, planning, executing, either one portion of the project on a specific domain area of the project, you can get your requirements for experience, right? One of the things that is important, especially for this group, is that these certifications are universal, global, which means that it doesn't really matter if your experience was in Canada or in another country. Planning is planning is planning, right? So planning in France is the same as planning in China, is the same planning in Africa, is the same as planning in whatever, right? So as long as you can show that you have planned, your requirements of actually doing work in planning are fulfilled, right? So with the study, with the experience, and with the test, which I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but it's not an easy test, 240 questions in 5 hours. With those 3 things in place, you can actually apply and get your PMP credential. And there are other credentials that are more related to agile world, right? So if you have been an agile person or have worked in agile environments, you can actually use that experience to prove that you have the agile experience and become an agile certified professional. Right now, PMI, which is the organization I belong to, Project Management Institute, has around 10, 12 different credentials based on those 3 elements that I told you, right? Why is that important? As Olga said at the beginning, because they show the market that you have that knowledge, that you have that experience, that you understand what you're doing, right? So one thing that I always in my courses and I mentor people and so on is go and try to get a credential. It helps you measure yourself against the market, but it's also something that is going to be recognized. In government, if you are expected to work in project, even in entry-level project positions like project coordinator or project analyst, we have the expectation of our preference that you have a project management credential, right? So again, you can contact me and I can give you more details, but you can go to the PMI webpage and Olga can send you the link through the chat and see what the requirements are, right? But it's basically what I just told you, and they're very, very, very standard across the board, right? And again, it's not a requirement to be in the country where you're getting your credential. No, this is a global credential. I had my PMP when I was in Colombia, and it has been useful to me for almost 20 years in Canada. Excellent, right? The last few credentials that I got in risk management and so on, I got in Canada, but I go all across the world talking about the stuff that I know in risk management and some other areas, because those are world recognized credentials. Okay. So that is the hour that I had set up for this presentation. So I can probably take a couple of questions before I have to go. So we can open up the mic and you can stop the recording now, Olga. And yeah, the people that are seeing the recording can actually contact me directly. So Camilo, you have